If you're an Eden Zero fan, then you know it's underrated. But what some fans are afraid to admit is that Eden Zero is so good that it's actually just as good, if not better, than manga like JJK and One Punch Man. To talk about that and where Eden Zero really sits, I have Axel Ablaze Productions. Axel Ablaze, why don't you say hi real quick?
Hello, thank you for having me. Yeah, I can't agree with that statement enough. That Eden Zero definitely deserves more praise than it gets, even from its own fans.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, for people out there who aren't aware, part of the reason why I have you in this video is because you were in the last Manga of the Year stream on Roger Space's channel, and you actually did a video of your own after the fact where you went on the record saying that, in your opinion, Eden Zero was the Manga of the Year. So I just want to ask you, would you still say that's the case, and has your reasoning for that changed at all?
Yeah, so on a yearly basis, I consider Manga of the Year when I consider it specifically, I'm considering what took place in that year. I'm not necessarily going over things from previous years unless there was some kind of lead up into it. And in my opinion, of all the series that I read last year that specifically took place with its content in that year, I thought that Eden Zero, in my opinion, was the manga of the year. It had the biggest impact to me because of the story, because of the characters, because of the absolutely crazy twists that happened in that Aoi Cosmo saga. I mean, it was something else. Honestly speaking, one of the best arcs I think that Hiro Mashima has ever written. I stuck my neck out there as the tiny fish in a really large pond in that stream, and I'm still shocked that I got as many people onto my side as I did with getting Eden Zero as far as it did. And I genuinely think that if more of the people involved in that stream had read Eden Zero, I think it is very possible that it could have gotten even farther than the top 8 that it got to. I strongly believe that. Whether or not it would have beat One Punch Man, who knows? One Punch Man had a lot going for it with the people that were involved in that stream. But at least in my opinion, it deserved to be Manga of the Year last year for what it did. And even after reading other series that took place last year, I still believe that to be the case, that for last year, Eden Zero was Manga of the Year.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think a lot of people, you talked about this in your video, like in preparation for the stream, you binged a ton of stuff. And I don't know the exact number, but plenty of people in preparation for that stream binged a good amount of Eden Zero, and it was reflected in the stream. When it got to Eden Zero, there were people, I'm pretty sure I can name JD Legend specifically, was like, you know what? Wasn't the biggest fan of Fairy Tail, but I read Eden Zero, and it was awesome. And, I mean, I think it's up there with JJK and One Punch Man. But this gets into my next point. There's this interesting trend that happened where before that stream, everyone was begging for Eden Zero to be in the stream, and they were like praying that it would win the stream. Fast forward to one of my recent videos where I didn't even say it was Manga of the Year. I just like made a reference to it in a thumbnail, and specifically Eden Zero fans were like, whoa, let's take it easy here. Manga of the Year, I don't know about that. So I want to ask you, obviously it's all subjective, but do you think people are justifiably saying that it's not necessarily a Manga of the Year, or do you think that maybe they just don't want to say it?
So I think there's that hesitancy, I think, with the fandom, because like was mentioned, this was a common theme in that stream, and I don't specifically remember if that was JD Legend or not. I know it was Chibi. I know he was one of those people who was just like, I was hesitant at first and then got into it. I know that was a common theme for a lot of the people that started voting for it. It's one of those things where if you were a Hiro Mashima fan prior to Eden Zero, if you were a Fairy Tail fan, like, Fairy Tail fans were definitely a butt of the joke online. Just because Fairy Tail is another one of those series where it's just like, oh man, the power of friendship makes it so that nobody that's actually plot relevant dies. But if you read Rave Master, definitely not the case necessarily in Rave Master, but that's the thing. You have a lot more people that were exposed to Fairy Tail with its manga and anime than you were with Rave Master previously. So that definitely gave people that kind of perception with Mashima. Now that being said, I think Eden Zero has been one of those series that has been strong out of the gate. It's one where there's a lot of impact in almost any given chapter, or any given arc. Emotionally, like the characters are really well done. I mean, that being said, Shiki is another one of those characters where he is still, at the end of the day, a power of friendship kind of guy. But, like, especially with the Drac and Joe arc, it was just kind of like, oh, wow, this can get dark. And the Aoi Cosmos arc got dark. It got very large scale, and it was really well done. But at the end of the day, you could still have people who are like, okay, well, I mean, this was really good, but, you know, I mean, well, JJK happened, or One Piece happened, and I think last year was the perfect storm of Eden Zero had this really fantastic build-up through the Aoi Cosmos arc. It ended on a very surprisingly high note just because of the impact that arc had. It all had a really great payoff. And whereas a lot of other series last year were either, you know, still building up to the more significant moments of the arc, or they had just finished a big one like the previous year, I think that's why Eden Zero really stood out. I completely understand where people would still be hesitant and be like, I mean, it was good, but like other series were really good, and potentially having that sway from other people affecting like their views of it. I mean, that being said, on top of it, obviously there are a lot of other factors to go along with Eden Zero. Compared to other series, it doesn't get as talked about as much. Its sales are definitely not as, you know, impressive as Fairy Tail's was, but it still has that dedicated fan base that keeps it going. Again, kind of trailing off, but that's my very unorganized thoughts on it. So yeah, I can elaborate on anything if you'd like, but that's kind of where I'm at.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I touched on this in another video, so I don't want to, and you already made a great point, so I don't want to expand on it too much, but I think a big part of it is just, unlike My Hero Academia, One Punch Man, JJK, Eden Zero doesn't have this big following of content creators or just like whatever Twitter accounts pushing it, talking about it, making it cool to say it's so good. But like you said, part of the reason I had you on was because, one, you read almost everything. I mean, you are human, you have to stop to sleep at some point.
Eventually.
But eventually, yeah. And you don't just read manga. You try to follow the behind the scenes and the promotional stuff. And I mean, you sold me on it. Color pages, table of contents, stuff like that. So you brought it up. I want to talk about it just quickly. How would you explain the sales?
So I think there are several different factors that are involved with it. So Eden Zero as it is now, compared to some of the weekly Shonen Jump series, the first week of any given Eden Zero like volume sales, we're talking like 20,000 units sold, which that compared to like newer series, yeah, that is really good. When you compare that to weekly Shonen Jump series, not so much, especially for a series that is that far in like Eden Zero is. Now that being said, the environment that Eden Zero is in is very different compared to weekly Shonen Jump. Weekly Shonen Jump is the best-selling manga magazine out there. It consistently sells the most volumes overall for some of its biggest hitters in the manga industry. You do have other examples that are in like various other magazines, and Weekly Shonen Magazine, which Eden Zero is in, is typically the second place runner-up with it. Like, especially with how Tokyo Revengers blew up, that is like hands down right now the biggest seller for Weekly Shonen Magazine. Now, because it doesn't have, you know, other series that are necessarily selling as well as Eden Zero in that aspect, especially with like its newer stuff, that's what allows Eden Zero to continue on. on top of the fact that, like, it does still have a strong enough fan following. And that's the thing. I think they're really enjoying them in the magazine, but they're not going out and buying physical copies of, like, the volumes themselves. And that could very well be the case for Eden Zero as well. So I don't want that being like the be all end all. Oh, like its sales are mid compared to other things. Like I said, it does well enough. Like, it gets enough promotion. Hiro Mashima is still a really popular, manga artist on Twitter. Like, you see a lot of responses to the spaces and whatnot that he hosts, and like his content regularly gets liked, retweeted, and whatnot. So he's got that following regardless of where the sales are at. So I really don't want people to discount it. I guess just to kind of sum it up, just because the sales aren't as strong compared to some of the heavy hitters in Weekly Shonen Jump, it is in a very different magazine. It's in a very different environment. It doesn't, see that same level of attention and drive that Weekly Shonen Jump gets, but even then, it still is a strong enough series, despite the fall off that it's had, that at the very least, I have no concerns with it getting axed prematurely like other series before it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's getting axed anytime soon. I think too many people like it for that to happen, and I think whoever runs the magazine is too confident in Mashima. The guy just does great work, and like you pointed out, he does his spaces, and now he has his YouTube channel, and I mean, he gets, for somebody that like just started a YouTube channel, he does pretty good with views.
He's also just constantly working. I mean, like, he's got that going on. He worked on Gate of Nightmares, the video game. He does a manga for Gate of Nightmares. I believe he still helps out on 100 Year Quest. He's not the artist for that, but
he does the storyboard, I believe.
Right, he does the storyboard. So he is just hands-on with everything. It's honestly a marvel that he's able to do as much as he does in any given month, let alone a week. So the work ethic is there. I hope that his health is able to maintain at the workload that he's doing, but I appreciate him a lot for all the stuff that he does on top of the weekly work he does on Eden Zero.
Yeah, and that's something I'm actually going to talk about, roughly about his work ethic, so be on the lookout for that in a future video. But just to quickly wrap things up, I want to get your final opinion. So, again, you went out on the record, both on the stream and you explicitly said it on your channel, that for whatever, last year, you thought Eden Zero was the manga of the year. We're getting just about halfway mark. We have had a lot happen since then in Eden Zero, and it looks like there's going to be a lot more, and it looks like the story is going to change drastically. So I'm going to put you on the spot right now. Where do you see Eden Zero going generally in terms of quality, in terms of where it contends with stories like JJK, One Punch Man, and do you think it will be manga of the year?
I think it's going strong. I think post time skip, it has been doing really well. There's a lot that's going on world building wise and everything with the characters right now that's really interesting to see. The scale of the current arc is pretty crazy despite all happening on one planet. There are so many moving pieces going on right now, and I think it's had a really strong showing for this first half of the year. Now, depending on how it can execute things for the second half of the year is really going to play into whether or not it, can be manga of the year for 2022. I think it's got the potential. It absolutely does. But whether or not it has that same emotional draw, which I think is a big part that played into last year, as well as just the shock factor that we got with, Ziggy blowing up everything. I don't know if we'll see that within this year. And I don't necessarily want this arc to end this year. So it's a conflict of interest. Like, I think if it doesn't end this year, like, it isn't necessarily going to have that final push to say that this was manga of the year for 2022. If it does end this year, absolutely possible that it could be, but I conversely would think maybe this is getting rushed. I don't know. Like, I think it's got a solid footing right now. I think it's made, like, really strong moves. So it could be Manga of the Year. But at the same time, again, since I read well over 200 ongoing series, there are a lot of other strong contenders this year so far as well. So I've got my hopes up. I'd like to see a repeat for this year. I think at the very least, it is definitely going to be a top 20, if not top 10 contender for the year. But there is still an entire half of the year left to go, and I'm at the very least excited to see what happens.
Absolutely, I could not agree more, and hopefully everyone listening, you guys agree too, and you will be supporting the series. It's just about time to close things out, so I just want to say thank you, Axel, for joining me. This was a great conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course, man. Anytime. Guys, make sure you visit his channel. I'll link it in the description. This has been an Eden Zero discussion. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like the video. Thank you for listening, and we hope to hear from you soon.